The night shift never got easier. It just became familiar in a way that felt almost peaceful. If you didn't think too hard about what peaceful meant. Marcus Torres had been driving the same route for 11 years, along the arterial roads that fed electricity to neighborhoods most people forgot existed once they drove past them. Tonight, like most nights, the city was shutting down around him. It was 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday in February, and the blizzard had been pressing down on the streets since sunset, transforming the world into something soft and suffocating. At 42 years old, Marcus had learned to love these hours. Not because they were quiet. They weren't. Not really. The hum of transformers, the whistle of wind through the electrical grid, the distant sound of a truck downshifting somewhere in the industrial corridor. It was all there, but people weren't. The city had mostly emptied itself of human demand, and that meant something. It meant he could do his job without anyone watching. It meant he could drive home without anyone needing something from him. It meant that for a few hours, the only person who required his attention was asleep. In their apartment, waiting for him to check in before turning off all the lights, Amara, his daughter, 8 years old, she slept with one arm hanging off the bed, always, without fail, the same position. And she woke up ready to argue about everything. The mornings were artillery battles. What color shirt? Why that breakfast? Can we talk about how Dad had to work late again? The questions came like rounds, relentless and sharp, and Marcus answered everyone, because she deserved that much. He had already failed her once, by not being enough to keep her mother around. He would not fail her again, by not being enough to show up. Jennifer had left 4 years ago, not cruelly, not with drama, just quietly, and with an honesty that had almost made it worse. "I can't do this version of things," she had said one morning, while Amara was still asleep. Marcus hadn't asked which version she meant. He didn't need to. He had been a father since Amara was born. After Jennifer left, he learned to be a mother too. The job shifted, expanded, consumed the space where his own ambitions used to live. There was no bitterness in this calculation anymore. There had been, years ago. But he had learned to fold it into something more useful. Something that felt like love, most of the time. Something that kept them both alive and moving forward. Even if forward was slower than it might have been. 40 minutes until home. 40 minutes until he could climb the stairs quietly. Push open Amara's bedroom door, observe his daughter in the vulnerability of sleep. He would check that her arm was still hanging off the bed, in that characteristic way. He would see that she was breathing, that she was whole, that the world hadn't done anything terrible to her while he was gone, and then he would be able to sleep himself, knowing he had done the one thing that mattered. The truck rumbled through the industrial section of town, past warehouses and maintenance facilities, and all the invisible infrastructure that kept the lights on for other people. Marcus worked for the city's Department of Electrical Infrastructure, maintenance and fault detection along the urban grid. It was the kind of work that didn't make headlines, didn't make money, but it made possible. It kept the lights on in hospitals, while people died or were born. It kept the lights on in schools, while children learned to read. It kept the lights on in homes, while families slept. The job was stable, the hours were punishing, the pay was exactly enough, as long as enough didn't require too precise a definition. He had applied once, just once, to an advanced electrical engineering program through the city. A 2-year track that could have moved him from maintenance into design, from fixing the grid to building it, from hourly wages to salaries that would let Amara have ballet lessons, or piano classes, or a mother who hadn't left. The application had been filled out 3 weeks before the deadline. He had withdrawn it 4 days before that same deadline, because there was no one to pick Amara up from school. On the days his shift ran long. There was no safety net. There was only him and her. And the apartment he paid for with a job that would never ask him to dream bigger. He told himself he would apply again next cycle. He had not. He was, in the way of many men who had quietly absorbed too many losses, extremely good at convincing himself that he was fine, that this life was enough, that a man could build a meaningful existence on the foundations of sacrifice and small daily rituals and the weight of a daughter's trust. 40 minutes until home. The truck carried him through the blizzard, the windshield wipers working in a rhythm that had become hypnotic. Marcus let his mind drift into the space it occupied on these long night drives, not quite thinking, not quite empty, just existing in the small warmth of the cab. While the world turned white and absolute outside, that was when he saw them. Hazard lights, pulsing in slow weakening waves through the snow. A black sedan, the kind he recognized from the city contracts folder on his desk, where companies with more money than sense regularly submitted for infrastructure maintenance approvals. Parked half on the curb along the edge of Crestwood Park. The engine was dead. The lights blinked like something running out of time. Each pulse weaker than the last, a heartbeat failing in real time. Marcus's foot eased off the accelerator without conscious thought. This was the kind of man he was. Not reckless, not heroic, just incapable of driving past something wrong. He had learned long ago that you couldn't choose the weight you carried. You could only choose whether you carried it toward other people or away from them. He pulled over without further deliberation. Patricia Whitmore had been awake for 36 hours, and the exhaustion had moved past fatigue into something that felt almost hallucinogenic. Her thoughts were moving strangely, landing on details that didn't matter. The thread coming loose on her wool coat, the way her hands wouldn't stop moving when she tried to keep them still, the specific quality of the fluorescent lights in the hotel room where she had been lying, on top of the sheets, fully dressed, listening to her phone vibrate against the nightstand. She was 44 years old, and had not felt fine in longer than she could accurately measure. Whitmore Development Group had been her father's company. His real accomplishment? The thing he had built from nothing, over 30 years, transforming a single property management office in Baltimore into one of the Mid-Atlantic region's most recognized real estate development groups. Her father, Robert Whitmore, had raised her alone. After her mother died when Patricia was 3, he had done this without complaint, without visible strain, as if the entire project of building a company and a daughter simultaneously was simply the natural order of things. He had handed her the company in his will, along with a trust structure that came with a single condition. She was to retain controlling interest for a minimum of 5 years before any sale or merger could be finalized without unanimous board approval. Robert had known his nephew Charles would try to dismantle what he built. He had not anticipated how efficiently Charles would work. The merger with Stratton Holdings had been Charles's project from the very beginning, a national commercial developer with aggressive urban expansion plans, the kind of firm that looked at neighborhoods and saw dollar signs instead of homes. The deal was structured to look like growth. The marketing materials promised innovation, revitalization, community investment. What it was in practice was a rezoning play, dressed up in the language of progress. 3 residential neighborhoods in the city's lower-income corridor would be reclassified as mixed commercial zones within 18 months of the merger closing. The residents who had lived there for decades would have no legal protection. Once the classification changed, landlords would sell to developers, rents would triple, families would scatter, and the neighborhoods would be transformed into exactly what the investors wanted: high-density mixed-use developments, expensive loft conversions, artisanal coffee shops, the whole machinery of gentrification, operating at maximum efficiency. The numbers worked beautifully on paper. 240 families would be displaced, but the spreadsheets showed $40 million in profit. Patricia had found her father's note 8 months ago, in a folder she wasn't technically supposed to have access to. His handwriting, precise and careful, even as he was clearly struggling with emotion. This is not what we built this for. We built this to create stability, not to destroy it. Below that, he had written, if I am not alive to stop this, Patricia will. She has a better conscience than ambition. I trust her. He had died 3 months later. She was the only person who had seen that note. She had never told anyone at the company, not the board, not her lawyers, not Charles, who had spent the last 2 years maneuvering board votes, securing financial commitments from Stratton, and systematically isolating her from authority. He had been patient and methodical, and absolutely confident that she would cave when the time came. But last night, at 2 in the morning, sitting alone in her hotel room in the business district, listening to her phone vibrate with increasingly urgent messages from her board, from Charles, from her ex-husband Vincent, who had become a company lawyer and was somehow still entangled in her financial life. Patricia had made a choice. She could not sign. She could not look her father's ghost in the face and tell him that she had chosen comfort over conscience. She could not walk through those neighborhoods knowing that she had the power to stop their destruction and had deliberately chosen not to. She could not become the person her uncle clearly believed she was, someone weak enough to be managed, flexible enough to compromise, ambitious enough to compromise her own integrity. But she also could not fight this alone. The board was already against her. Charles controlled the votes. Vincent controlled the legal documents. She had no leverage, no allies, no plan. She had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had run. At 2:15 in the morning, she had left the hotel, without her security detail, without her personal assistant, without anything except her coat, her keys, her car. She had driven into the blizzard without a destination, without a strategy, beyond the simple, desperate need to not be where people could find her. Her phone had kept vibrating. The messages had kept coming. Unknown numbers had started calling. At some point, the board had probably alerted her security team. Vincent would have started making calls. Charles would be enjoying this, the evidence that his niece was emotionally unstable, unfit for leadership, exactly as unreliable as he had been suggesting all along. She had driven for 40 minutes before the engine died. The car had given her no warning. One moment the engine was running, the next moment it was simply over, and she was coasting to a stop at the edge of Crestwood Park, the same neighborhood she was supposed to help destroy. The irony was not lost on her. Even God seemed to have a sense of timing. She had sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, understanding that this was the moment where she could either keep running or finally stop. She had turned on the hazard lights. She had stepped out into the blizzard in a wool coat that was not built for this temperature, without gloves, without a hat, without anything but the stubborn knowledge that some choices could only be made when you were completely alone and completely out of options. The cold was immediate and absolute. It settled into her posture within minutes, but her face remained composed. She had spent 20 years learning how to control her expressions, in rooms full of powerful men, waiting for her to show fear. She would not break now, not even standing alone in the blizzard, next to a car she could not fix. That was when she saw the truck pull over ahead. Marcus opened the truck door and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was shocking, the kind that made your throat burn when you breathed. But he barely noticed it. He was already focused on the car, on the woman standing beside it, on the problem that needed solving. She turned to look at him as he approached. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her wealth, though her clothing made that apparent. Not her status, though the car advertised it. He noticed that she was cold, genuinely cold. Her shoulders held so tightly they shook slightly, despite her composure. But when she turned to look at him, her face was dry, composed, like someone who had learned a long time ago. That tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. That was when he understood. She wasn't cold from the blizzard, she was cold from fear. "Engine's dead," she said, not as a question, but as information. "I can call roadside assistance," Marcus said, already reaching for his phone. "They can have you back on the road in an hour, maybe less." She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, faster than he expected. And her hand gripped his arm. Not gentle, firm. The grip of someone used to controlling situations, to directing action, to people doing what she asked. "Don't call anyone," she said. Her voice was low and precise, but he heard something underneath it. The edge of someone who had already jumped and was hoping the net was there. "And don't tell anyone you saw me." Marcus looked at her hand on his arm. It was shaking, just barely, but it was shaking. He made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. "Come on," he said quietly. "I'll take you somewhere safe." She didn't question this. She didn't thank him. She simply released his arm and moved toward the truck, understanding without having to be told that he was offering her exactly what she needed. Not judgment, not questions. Just shelter from whatever was chasing her. They didn't talk in the cab. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through the door seals. Marcus could feel her vibrating with something. Not fear anymore, but calculation. Her eyes tracked every car they passed, every intersection, every camera at the traffic lights. She was already 3 moves ahead of wherever they were going. Still planning, still strategizing. Even in the moment of escape, he drove 2 miles east, to a 24-hour diner tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered electronics repair shop, the kind of place that existed for people who needed to disappear for a few hours, where the waitresses asked no questions and the coffee was infinite. He had come here once, 4 years ago, The night after Jennifer left, he had sat in a booth and drunk coffee and tried to understand how a marriage could simply end, without drama, without anger, without anything except two people realizing they couldn't do this version of things anymore. They sat in a corner booth, under fluorescent lights that made everything look worse than it was. Patricia wrapped both hands around a coffee cup she didn't drink from. A habit maybe, something to hold on to, while her mind was somewhere else entirely. Marcus sat across from her, his phone face up on the table. He noticed her notice this, the deliberate gesture, the signal that he wasn't recording anything, wasn't calling anyone, wasn't weaponizing this moment against her. Her eyes met his for just a moment, and in that meeting something passed between them that neither of them quite had words for yet. "You're not going to she said finally. "I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know." She studied him for a long moment, the work jacket, the city ID clipped to his chest, the particular steadiness of someone who had learned not to show when things surprised him. She was cataloging him, Marcus realized, taking inventory of who this stranger was and whether he was safe. "I need to be somewhere that isn't on any camera or record," she said. "For the next few hours, I'm not in danger, I'm not hurt. I just need time that nobody is tracking." "Your phone's been going off since you got in my truck," Marcus said, stating a fact. "I know. Someone's going to report you missing." "Someone already has," she said. "Probably my head of security, the board, my ex-husband, because he always knows when I'm vulnerable." The way she said vulnerable made it clear. She hated the word, hated that she was it. "That's not the problem I'm trying to solve tonight." Marcus studied her, really studied her, the composure of someone who had sat in rooms full of people, waiting for her to break, and had simply refused. But her hands wrapped the coffee cup like it was the only solid thing in the room. And beneath the control was something he recognized, because he had felt it himself. On nights when Amara asked why her mother didn't call, the sound of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. He set his phone down and turned it over so the screen was dark. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since we got to the diner." "And you're still here. You haven't given me a reason to leave," he said. "Yet." That yet hung between them, a promise, a threat, a door she could close or walk through. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, without looking away, without softening it with apology or explanation, she said, "If I sign a contract on Friday morning, 240 families lose their homes. Not because the project fails, because it succeeds exactly the way the people behind it planned." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. He had grown up 11 blocks from Crestwood. He had watched that neighborhood his entire childhood, watched it get slowly, steadily, revitalized when he was 19. The laundromats replaced by boutiques, the bodegas replaced by wine bars, the families who had lived there for 30 years replaced by people who could afford triple the rent. His own mother had been one of those families. She had left rather than watch herself become invisible in her own neighborhood. "Tell me everything," he said quietly, "and then we figure out how to stop this." For the next 3 hours, Patricia spoke. She didn't dump it all at once. She revealed it layer by layer, piece by piece, sentence by careful sentence, as if she were peeling back skin to show him the bone underneath. She told him about her father building the company, about the inheritance, about the trust structure that was supposed to protect his legacy. She told him about the merger proposal, about the rezoning play, about the beautiful spreadsheets that showed $40 million in profit, alongside 240 displaced families. She told him about finding her father's note, about those words, "This is not what we built this for," written in his careful handwriting, and then in her own careful handwriting, the response she had written but never sent. "I promise you, Dad, I will not let this happen." She told him about Uncle Charles, who had been patient and methodical for 2 years, securing board votes, making strategic hires, isolating her from allies. She told him about Vincent, her ex-husband, who had become a company lawyer, and who somehow still controlled parts of her financial life, through the messiness of their separation agreement, which still wasn't finalized after 3 years. She told him about the merger signing scheduled for Friday morning, about the fact that her signature was the only thing standing between the deal and legality, about the fact that without her, the investors would pull out, and the whole structure would collapse, about the fact that Charles knew this and was counting on her eventual capitulation. "He thinks I'll cave," Patricia said at 4:47 in the morning. "He thinks I'll come to my senses, understand that emotion isn't a business strategy, realize that a woman can't possibly run a major real estate firm on principle alone." Marcus asked the hard questions that she needed to hear. Why not resign? Why not fight internally? Why run? Patricia answered each one, slowly, honestly. Because if I resign, Charles gets controlling interest, and the deal goes through anyway. Because fighting internally means fighting people who have already made their choice, and who see me as an obstacle. Because running was the only way to break the pattern. She told him about her mother, who had died when Patricia was 3, about her father raising her alone, teaching her that integrity was a practical choice, not a luxury, about sitting at board meetings, feeling his absence, feeling the weight of his note, feeling the specific terror of becoming someone he wouldn't recognize. Marcus listened. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't offer false comfort. He just listened, the way someone listens, when they understand that words are secondary to presence. At 5:15 in the morning, Patricia's voice broke. When she described the families who would be displaced, she talked about them in specific terms, the Johnsons on Maple Street, who had raised 5 children in the same house, the Martinez family, who had built a bodega that had served their neighborhood for 20 years, the elderly couple, who had chosen to age in place, rather than move south like everyone else. That was when Marcus reached across the table. He didn't take her hand, not yet. He simply took the coffee cup from her shaking hands and set it gently on the table between them. It was their first touch that meant something. Beyond survival, it was intimate in a way that physical contact alone couldn't have been. It was a man saying without words, "I see you breaking. I'm not going to look away from this. I'm not going to pretend it's not happening." Patricia's eyes filled. She didn't cry. She had learned too well how to keep that kind of release contained. But something in her shoulders loosened. The tension that had been holding her rigid for 36 hours began to transmute into something else. Not hope exactly, but the possibility that she didn't have to carry this alone. "Okay," Marcus said, "tell me everything. We'll figure it out from there." And slowly, as the night moved toward morning, and the diner began to fill with the first morning customers, truckers, shift workers, people who had been awake as long as they had, Patricia Whitmore told a Black City electrician her entire moral crisis, and he listened like it mattered, because to him it did. They left the diner at 6:47 in the morning. The blizzard had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the world transformed, white and clean and new, like it had reset overnight. There was something almost violent about it, the sudden peace after such intensity. Patricia looked at the snow-covered streets and felt something break open inside her chest. "What now?" she asked. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to stop this without burning down your entire life." "I may have already done that," Patricia replied. "Probably," Marcus agreed, "but at least you'll do it with witness. You won't do this alone." They drove to Marcus's apartment. It was a risk. Her ex-husband's people had resources, could potentially track her phone location, could be looking for her. But Marcus had decided, somewhere in the hours between 2 and 6 in the morning, that risk was secondary to presence. She needed to understand that someone believed in what she was doing. She needed to see what a life built on principle actually looked like. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen the size of a hallway. But it was clean, more than clean. It was cared for. There was art on the walls. Patricia recognized immediately as children's drawings, watercolor trees, crayon self-portraits, a clay bird with one wing slightly larger than the other. "Amara?" Patricia asked, looking at the artwork. "My daughter," Marcus said. "She's at my mother's tonight. They don't get to see each other much, so when they do, they try to make it count." Patricia was quiet, absorbing this information, understanding that Marcus had already lost the mother figure in his own life, had already made the sacrifices that she was now contemplating making. She walked slowly through the apartment, running her fingers along the edge of a bookshelf that held children's books, Marcus's work manuals, and what appeared to be an incomplete engineering textbook, with Marcus's name written carefully in the front cover. "You are going to do it," she said. Not a question. "The engineering degree?" Marcus sat down on the small couch. "Yeah, applied once. Withdrew a few days before the deadline." "Why?" No one to pick her up from school. When my shift ran long, no safety net, just me and her. And a job that pays enough if we don't ask for too much. Patricia understood exactly what he was telling her. She sat down next to him. Not touching yet, just existing in the same space. You gave up your entire future for her, Patricia said. No, Marcus corrected gently. I postponed it. There's a difference. And honestly, I'm not sure I made the sacrifice I'm supposed to have made. We survived. She's healthy. She's smart and argumentative and whole. That's not nothing. But they both knew it was something. It was everything. It was the thing Patricia was about to risk, in order to do the right thing. Patricia's phone had been off since she got in Marcus's truck. Now, sitting in his small apartment with his daughter's artwork looking at her from the walls, she turned it back on. It immediately exploded. 47 missed calls, 112 text messages, emails spilling in like an avalanche. The board had convened an emergency meeting. Charles was demanding to know her location. Vincent had left 5 increasingly angry voicemails. About the separation agreement, her lawyer Margaret had marked 3 calls as urgent. Marcus watched her scroll through the messages, watched her shoulders tighten as she absorbed the scope of the response. Call the lawyer, he said. You need to know exactly what you're facing. Patricia did. Margaret answered on the first ring. She hadn't slept either. Patricia, where are you? Margaret's voice came through the speaker, sharp with concern, and something darker underneath it. Somewhere safe. I need you to tell me what happens if I don't sign the merger. There was a long silence. Then, Patricia, you cannot call an emergency board meeting 24 hours before the signing. It will look suspicious. It will look like you're backing out. Because I am, Patricia said calmly. Then you'll lose controlling interest. Charles will have grounds to challenge the trust structure. You'll be legally tied up for years. Stratton Holdings will sue for breach of contract. You're looking at $50 million in damages minimum. Marcus watched Patricia absorb this. He watched her calculate the cost of integrity. I don't care, she said finally. Make the call, Margaret. Call an emergency board meeting for Thursday evening, or I'll do it myself. Patricia, make the call. She hung up. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Patricia took off Marcus's jacket and handed it back to him. She looked smaller without it, but she also looked stronger. She looked like someone who had made a choice and was willing to live with the consequences. I'm going to the hotel, Patricia said. I'm going to shower. I'm going to change clothes. I'm going to walk into that board meeting Thursday evening and tell them exactly why I'm killing this deal. And I'm going to do it alone, because that's my choice to own. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. He had been thinking he needed to save her. He understood now that she didn't need saving. She needed witness. She needed to know that someone saw her choosing correctly and would stand with her anyway. Okay, he said. And then, Patricia continued, everything falls apart. My company, my marriage finalization, my reputation in circles I've spent 20 years building. She looked at him directly. I wanted you to know that, before I ask you to be part of it. Before I ask if you'll... She didn't finish. He did. I'll be there, Marcus said. Board meeting, fallout, all of it, if you want me. Her eyes filled. She let one tear fall. Why? She asked. Because, Marcus thought. Amara once asked me why her mother didn't call, and I said it wasn't her fault, but maybe the real answer is, some people are just afraid, and some people choose to be brave. And I want her to see what brave looks like. I want my daughter to understand that when you meet someone who is willing to destroy everything for principle, you bear witness, you don't look away. Because someone has to bear witness, he said out loud, to the moment you stop being afraid. She kissed him then. It wasn't gentle or slow burn or anything like the romantic language would suggest. It was desperate and real, and exactly what they both needed. It was the kiss of 2 people who had just decided that some things were worth more than comfort. Thursday evening came with the weight of inevitability. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Whitmore Development Building had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The table was mahogany and cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. The leather chairs had been purchased from some European firm that specialized in power furniture. Everything in the room was designed to remind you that some people had resources and others didn't. Patricia sat at the head of the table, wearing a dark gray suit. That had belonged to her for 10 years. It had the texture of something she had worn into a second skin. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup was minimal. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman about to destroy her own company. The board members filed in slowly. Uncle Charles was first, a man in his 60s, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no. Next came David Shue, the CFO, who had been with the company for 15 years and who had the expression of someone who had already understood which way the wind was blowing. Then James Patterson, the operations director, who looked concerned but not yet invested. And finally the rest, the finance committee, the legal advisors, the lawyers who had been paid obscene amounts of money to make the merger structure legally airtight. Vincent was there too, Patricia's ex-husband. He had the expression of someone who already knew what she was about to do and who believed he could still control the outcome. Charles opened the meeting with the confidence of someone who had already won. Patricia, I assume you've called this meeting to finalize the Friday signing. I've taken the liberty of having the final documents printed and I'm not signing the merger, Patricia said calmly. The silence that followed was absolute. Charles' expression didn't change for exactly 3 seconds. Then, Patricia, I think you're exhausted. The stress of this deal has been significant. Why don't we take a brief recess and... I found Father's note, Patricia said. The color drained from Charles's face. In a folder in his personal files, the folder you clearly didn't know existed, the one where he documented his rejection of this deal, 8 months before he died. Patricia pulled out a photograph of the handwritten note. She set it on the table in front of her. He wrote, "This is not what we built this for. We built this to create stability, not to destroy it." David Shue's expression shifted. James Patterson leaned forward. The lawyers began whispering to each other. "Patricia, you're making an emotional decision," Vincent said carefully, using the tone he had perfected over years of marriage. The tone that suggested she was being unreasonable, hysterical, unfit for major decisions. "Your father wrote that note years ago. Markets change. Opportunities evolve. We need to think about shareholder value. About what?" Patricia interrupted. "About the 240 families we're going to displace? About the neighborhoods we're going to destroy? About the fact that this deal isn't about growth. It's about rezoning 3 lower-income neighborhoods. So we can sell them to the highest bidder?" She spread out the documents that her lawyer had prepared overnight. The rezoning proposal, the displacement projections, the timeline that showed families being pushed out of their homes within 18 months, the profit margins that had been calculated on the back of their suffering. "This is what my father rejected," Patricia said, "and I'm rejecting it too." Charles's expression hardened. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its reasonableness and gained an edge of something sharper. "You don't have the authority to make this decision unilaterally. The board has already voted to support this merger. Stratton Holdings is expecting to proceed. You're in breach of fiduciary duty if you stop this." "Then sue me," Patricia said. "But you'll have to explain in court why you forged my signature on preliminary documents. That's fraud, criminal liability." The silence was different now. Guilty, terrified. Patricia pulled out another set of documents. This one was an email chain from 5 years ago, recovered from old company servers. The email from Charles to Stratton Holdings, using fake approval from Patricia's father. The follow-up emails where Charles himself had written Patricia's approval to preliminary documents, signing her name without authorization. "These are copies," Patricia said calmly. "The originals have already been sent to federal prosecutors, along with documentation of your fraud, so you can sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, or we can accept that the merger is over and that you'll be spending the next several years dealing with criminal charges." She looked directly at Vincent. "That includes you, by the way. You reviewed these documents. You knew they were forged. Your law license is about to become a liability." Vincent's face went pale. He looked like he wanted to speak, but no words came. Patricia stood up. She was shaking, the adrenaline now draining from her system, but her voice was steady. "The merger is dead. Stratton Holdings will be informed within the hour. I'm issuing a press release tonight, explaining that this company is recommitting to community-centered development, and we will be cooperating fully with federal investigators." She turned and walked toward the door. "Patricia!" Charles called out, his voice sharp with desperation. You're destroying this company. You're destroying everything your father built. She paused at the door. She turned back. No, she said quietly. I'm saving it. There's a difference. And then she left. Marcus was waiting in the hallway. She didn't need to explain anything. He simply took her hand and led her toward the elevator, away from the conference room, away from her uncle, away from the wreckage of the life she had just deliberately destroyed. The next 24 hours moved in a blur of consequences. By Friday morning, when the merger signing was supposed to happen, Stratton Holdings had already withdrawn from the deal. The stock price of Whitmore Development had plummeted 34%. On the news of the merger collapse, investors were calling for Patricia's resignation. Charles had hired a criminal defense attorney. Vincent was facing an ethics investigation from the state bar. Federal prosecutors were preparing charges. The press had gotten hold of Patricia's leaked statement about the rezoning plot, and the story was spreading like wildfire. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Powerful woman sabotages own company to protect vulnerable communities. Whistleblower, hero, corporate conscience, activist CEO. But Patricia didn't feel like a hero. She felt hollowed out. She sat in Marcus's apartment Friday evening, curled on his couch, trying to understand how her entire life could have come apart in 48 hours. You did the right thing, Marcus said quietly, sitting beside her. I destroyed my life, Patricia said. You saved it, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. You lived by your father's principles. You didn't become your uncle. Patricia leaned against him, exhausted and terrified. I'm going to lose everything. Probably, Marcus said. He wasn't comforting her with false hope. He was just being honest. But you'll lose it with your conscience intact. That matters. They sat in silence for a long time. Marcus's arm around her, both of them understanding that this moment, this horrible, terrifying, exhilarating moment, was the moment everything actually changed. Later that evening, after Patricia had tried unsuccessfully to sleep, she made a decision. I need to meet Amara, she said. Marcus looked at her carefully. That's a risk. It's public. It's commitment. I know, Patricia said. I want to anyway. So on Saturday morning, Marcus brought his daughter home from his mother's house, and Patricia sat in his living room, surrounded by Amara's artwork, watching his 8-year-old daughter size her up with the particular intelligence of a child who had already been abandoned once and who was perfectly capable of recognizing the warning signs again. Are you the lady Dad was with that night? Amara asked, without preamble. I am, Patricia said. The one on the news? The CEO lady? That's me. Amara studied her for a long moment. Then, did you really turn down $400 million? $380 million, Patricia corrected. And yes. Why? Because it would have hurt a lot of families, and I couldn't do that. Amara seemed to accept this reasoning. She climbed onto the couch next to Patricia with the easy confidence of a child who had decided she liked this person. My mom left, she said. No preamble, no softening. I know, Patricia said carefully. Your dad told me. She said she couldn't do this version of things. What does that mean? Marcus, standing in the kitchen doorway, had gone very still. Patricia chose her words carefully. It means she got scared, Patricia said, and instead of staying and working through the scary part, she left. That wasn't your fault, and it wasn't because you weren't worth staying for. But she still left. Yes, Patricia said, she did. And that's the hurt you get to carry with you. But other people can stay. Other people might choose to show up, even when it's hard. Amara considered this. Then she asked, Are you going to stay? I don't know yet, Patricia said, which was honest. But I'm here right now, and I'm not here because I need somewhere to hide, or because your dad is convenient. I'm here because I care about him, and because I care about you, and because I want to see what happens next. It was not a promise. It was something more honest than a promise. It was the simple acknowledgement that she was choosing them, moment by moment, without guarantees or certainty. Amara seemed to accept this too. She leaned against Patricia and watched television with her. This girl whose mother had left, sitting close to this woman who had chosen principle over comfort. Marcus watched from the kitchen doorway and understood that his daughter was seeing something important. That when you meet someone willing to stand for what's right, even when it costs them everything, You let them. You don't push them away in advance because of someone else's abandonment. The legal battle that followed was neither quick nor gentle. Stratton Holdings sued Patricia personally for damages. The legal discovery process revealed the extent of the fraud. Charles's forged documents went back further than anyone had suspected. Vincent's complicity was deeper. The federal prosecutors moved slowly but methodically, building their case. Patricia spent her days in depositions and lawyer meetings. She spent her nights learning that legal systems were not designed for redemption, only for blame and counter-blame. Her personal assets were frozen. The company was technically hers, but it was a shell, bleeding money, unable to secure new development deals. For his part, Marcus took time off work that he couldn't afford to lose. Money was suddenly critical. His income was the only thing keeping them stable, but Patricia needed him at the depositions. She needed him in the waiting rooms. She needed him to believe that she had done the right thing, when everyone else was telling her she was insane. Amara noticed the distraction. She asked Marcus directly, "Are you choosing her over me?" It was the worst thing she could have said, and the most understandable. Marcus sat down on the edge of her bed and looked at his daughter with perfect honesty. "No," he said, "I'm choosing to do the right thing in front of you, and that happens to involve helping Patricia. It's not instead of you. It's so you can see what it looks like when someone shows up for what matters." "Even when it's scary?" Amara asked. "Especially when it's scary," Marcus said. It was a conversation about more than just Patricia. It was about his mother, who had left him when he was Amara's age. It was about Jennifer, who had left Amara when she was 4. It was about the people who stayed, and the people who ran, and the people who chose to stay, even when running would have been easier. One evening, while reviewing documents for her deposition, Patricia asked Marcus directly about his withdrawn application. "You could have applied again," she said, "after Amara got older, after the worst of the single parenting was over. Why didn't you?" "I told myself I would," Marcus said. "Every year I told myself next cycle. But the thing about sacrifice is that it becomes identity. After a while, you can't tell the difference between what you chose and who you are." Patricia understood exactly what he meant. She had built her identity around being the CEO, the inheritor, the keeper of her father's legacy. When she rejected the merger, she hadn't just rejected a deal, she had rejected the identity that came with the role. She had become someone without definition. "I want to help you get back into that program," Patricia said carefully. "I don't need rescuing," Marcus said, the tone holding just enough edge to show her he meant it. "I know, but I want to help. It's not rescuing, it's recognizing that you were always worth it. And the only reason you stopped trying was because the world didn't make space for you." "I can make space." Marcus wanted to refuse. He wanted to maintain the pretense that he was fine, that his sacrifice had been reasonable, that a man could build meaning without ambition. But looking at Patricia, this woman who had chosen principle over comfort, who was losing everything but had somehow become more real, he understood that the greatest gift he could give her was to let her witness his becoming, to let her see what happens when you stop accepting the small life that was offered and start building the large life you actually wanted. "Okay," he said, "help me." 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, everything changed. Patricia's lawyer, Margaret, called with news. That made no sense at first. They had found something in old company archives, an email chain from 7 years ago, between Robert Whitmore, Patricia's father, and Charles Whitmore, her uncle. In these emails, Robert had explicitly detailed his rejection of the rezoning deal. He had written, in clear language, that the merger violated company ethics, and that he would never allow it to proceed. More than that, there was documentation of Charles attempting to move forward with the deal after Robert's death, using forged documents to suggest Robert had approved preliminary work. It was criminal fraud, clear-cut, prosecutable. But there was more. The same discovery process revealed that Stratton Holdings had been using falsified environmental impact reports to push the rezoning through. They had hidden a major aquifer issue that would have failed the zoning reclassification. They had been committing fraud against the community, against the city, against anyone who stood in their way. This revelation triggered an entirely new investigation. Federal prosecutors who had been building a case against Charles and Vincent suddenly had an even bigger target. Stratton Holdings itself. Within weeks, Stratton Holdings faced criminal charges. Their CEO and board members were indicted. The environmental fraud was made public, and suddenly the narrative shifted again. Not just woman blows up company, but woman exposes massive corporate conspiracy. The lawsuit against Patricia was dismissed. Criminal charges against Charles were elevated. Vincent's situation became significantly worse when prosecutors found evidence of his knowledge of the environmental fraud, federal crime, conspiracy charges. Patricia was no longer a defendant, she was a key witness, a whistleblower, suddenly eligible for protections she didn't even know existed. But the most important shift was psychological. She had been right. Not just ethically right, but actually, factually, provably right. Her father had been right. The merger would have destroyed neighborhoods through fraud and corruption. She had stopped it the moment Patricia understood that she might actually survive this. She sat in Marcus's apartment and cried for the first time, real tears. Not the controlled releases from before, but actual grief and relief and vindication, pouring out of her system all at once. Marcus held her and let her break apart, understanding that this was necessary. This was the moment where she could finally process what she had lost, knowing that the loss had meant something. 3 months after the initial depositions, Patricia made a choice about what came next. She could rebuild Whitmore Development as it had been, a commercial real estate firm focused on profit, focused on growth, focused on the architecture of power. She could rehire her staff. She could secure new clients. She could probably, given time, rebuild her reputation in business circles. Or she could do something different. She met with Marcus on a Saturday morning, in the apartment that had become their shared space. Officially, he still paid rent on his own place, but practically he was here most nights now. Amara was at Marcus's mother's house again, giving them space to talk. "I want to start over," Patricia said, "not rebuild the company as it was, transform it entirely." She had already done research, already filed papers, already made arrangements. Whitmore Development would become a development firm with a specific mission: community-centered development, real investment in neighborhoods that had been neglected, affordable housing, not luxury conversions, community input, not top-down planning, transparency, not hidden rezoning schemes. The first projects, Patricia said, would be Crestwood, the East District, and Riverside, the neighborhoods that were supposed to be destroyed. We actually improved them. Real improvement, with community leadership. She paused. "And I want to hire a lead engineer, someone who understands electrical infrastructure, someone who understands the neighborhoods, someone who can design systems that actually serve people, not just extract profit from them." Marcus understood what she was offering before she said the title. $85,000 a year to start, Patricia continued. Full benefits, tuition coverage for your engineering degree, authority to build a team of 5 engineers, real partnership in how we approach development. It was not charity, it was not rescue, it was a woman with resources, recognizing a man with capability and creating space for him to expand. "I'm not doing this because I feel guilty," Patricia said. I'm doing this because you were always worth it. The world just didn't make space." Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. This was not about Patricia saving him. This was about Patricia witnessing him, seeing his value, creating a structure where that value could actually expand. "Okay," he said, "when do I start?" The final piece of their reckoning came unexpectedly. Vincent showed up at Marcus's apartment unannounced. He still had Marcus's address from company files, still had access to information about Patricia that he shouldn't have had. Marcus answered the door to find his ex-wife's ex-husband standing on his threshold, looking like a man whose entire world had collapsed. "I need to talk to Patricia," Vincent said. Marcus considered closing the door. Instead, he called Patricia out. She appeared in the doorway behind him, her expression hardening, the moment she saw Vincent. "I'm leaving," Vincent said without preamble. "Moving out of state. The federal prosecutors have told me I'm facing significant time if this goes to trial." "Okay," Patricia said, her voice neutral. "I wanted to tell you something first." Vincent's voice had lost its characteristic control. He sounded tired, broken. "When I married you, it was because I thought I could manage you, control you. You were so afraid of being alone that I thought I could keep you small and dependent, and you would never leave." Patricia said nothing. "But you didn't stay," Vincent continued. "You broke out. the moment you found something worth breaking for. And I realized that I had married someone who was capable of choosing principle over comfort, that I had married someone extraordinary, and spent years trying to make her ordinary. He looked at Marcus. Don't do that, Vincent said. Don't spend years trying to keep her small. Let her be who she actually is. Marcus didn't respond. Patricia reached down and took his hand. Is that all? Patricia asked. Vincent seemed to realize that he was expecting forgiveness that he didn't deserve. He nodded and turned to leave. Then he paused. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think what you did, refusing the merger, was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do, and I was too broken to support it. Then he was gone. Patricia and Marcus stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down the hallway, understanding that this was the end of something. Not just their relationship with Vincent, but the version of themselves that Vincent had tried to keep them as. 3 months had passed since the merger collapsed. When the Crestwood Community Center officially opened its doors, the building rose 5 stories above what used to be an abandoned commercial lot. Marcus had designed the entire electrical and structural system, not just the technical specifications, but the philosophy behind it. Every wire, every circuit, every system was designed to be transparent, accessible, understandable. Community members could learn how buildings actually worked. They could understand the infrastructure that made their homes possible. The ground floor held affordable housing units, rent capped at 30% of median income, permanent protections written into the building covenants, so future developers couldn't reverse the commitment. The second floor was a community kitchen and job training center. The third was a literacy program and children's center. The upper floors were offices and meeting spaces for community organizations that had been displaced from their neighborhoods. Patricia stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, wearing a simple dress that cost less than anything she owned 3 years ago. This was intentional. She was learning to exist without the armor of wealth, learning to let people see her, actually see her, without the buffer of designer clothes and expensive watches. News crews were there, local television, community bloggers, journalists who had been covering the story of Whitmore Development's transformation. Patricia was interviewed about the project, about the merger she had refused, about the choice to rebuild her company around community instead of profit. I didn't sacrifice anything, Patricia said, looking directly into the camera. I gained everything, my company, my conscience, my family. That's not sacrifice, that's grace. Marcus was there too, standing beside her, holding Amara's hand. He was interviewed as the lead engineer, asked about his role in designing the building's systems. I always knew what I was capable of, Marcus said. I just didn't know anyone would believe it. Patricia believed it, so I did. Amara, when asked what she thought about the community center, simply said, It's not just my family's home, it's everyone's home now. That's what my dad and Patricia decided. The cutting of the ribbon was not dramatic. It was simple. Patricia, Marcus, and Amara cut it together. 3 people who had entered each other's lives through a blizzard and had chosen to build something real together. Community members who had moved into the affordable housing units lined up to thank them, a family with 5 children who had been living in a shelter for 2 years, an elderly couple who had been forced out of Crestwood 15 years ago and had finally made it home, young families, intergenerational families, families of every configuration, all of them having finally found stability. The neighborhoods didn't change overnight, they changed slowly, the way actual transformation happens. With struggle, with setbacks, with the ongoing negotiation between community needs and practical constraints. But they changed in the direction of care instead of extraction. They changed under the principle that neighborhoods belong to the people who lived in them, not to the developers, who looked at land and saw only numbers. 6 months later, the legal proceedings concluded. Uncle Charles was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. He would spend the rest of his effective life in prison, his legacy destroyed, his name becoming synonymous with corporate corruption. The sentencing was swift and thorough. The judge made clear that his crimes were not victimless. They were crimes against actual communities, actual families, actual lives. Stratton Holdings was dissolved entirely. The CEO faced 15 years. The board members faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to environmental crimes. The company's assets were liquidated and distributed through a settlement agreement that included compensation to the communities harmed by their schemes. Vincent was disbarred. His law license, which he had spent 20 years building, was revoked permanently. He ended up in a different state, working a job that didn't require a security clearance or professional credentials. He had become a person of no particular consequence, which seemed like the appropriate punishment for someone who had tried to keep extraordinary people small. Patricia's separation agreement from Vincent was finalized in her favor. The delays that had plagued it for 3 years suddenly dissolved once the federal prosecutors demonstrated Vincent's knowledge of multiple crimes. He had no leverage left. Patricia owned her life again. For the first time in years, Patricia was free, not free from struggle. The work of rebuilding her company into something good was constant, but free from the legal entanglement, the emotional manipulation, the weight of trying to maintain respectability. While surrounded by corruption, she and Marcus never formally married. This was intentional. They had both been married before and knew how easily legal structures could become traps. Instead, they chose each other fresh every day. They put their names on the deed to a house together. Not a grand house, but a solid one, in the neighborhood that Patricia had grown up in. They built a life that was visible and real, and grounded in actual choice, rather than legal obligation. Amara, now 10, still called Patricia by her first name. They had never discussed the alternative. Patricia was not her mother, would never be her mother, and all three of them understood that there was strength in honoring that boundary. Jennifer, Amara's biological mother, had gotten sober and gotten therapy, and while she would never be the parent she should have been, she had become a real person in her daughter's life. Not redemptive, but honest. Marcus completed his engineering degree 18 months after his first day at Whitmore Development. He walked across the stage to receive his diploma, while Patricia and Amara cheered from the audience, both of them crying. This was not about individual achievement. It was about a man reclaiming a part of himself that he had been forced to sacrifice. It was about a woman witnessing his becoming. The work Patricia and Marcus began in Crestwood, East District, and Riverside didn't stop at those three neighborhoods. Their success became a model. Federal agencies began directing funding towards similar community-centered development projects. Universities started researching their approach. Other developers, not many, but some, began asking whether profit was actually the only legitimate goal. Of real estate development, Patricia gave talks. She testified before City Council about community development. She shared her story without dramatizing it, without claiming credit for transformation that was only just beginning. She was clear she was one person who made one choice. The real transformation came from communities reclaiming agency over their own neighborhoods. Her Uncle Charles's trial became a case study in business schools. His emails were used to teach students about fraud and corruption. Her father's note, the note that had started everything, became an artifact of moral leadership. It was displayed in museums, alongside other documents of corporate ethics. Robert Whitmore's insistence on principle became posthumous vindication. Marcus, meanwhile, was designing infrastructure systems for 7 different community development projects. He had built a team of engineers who understood that their job was not just to build systems, but to teach communities to understand and maintain their own infrastructure. He started teaching night classes to neighborhood residents, demystifying electrical systems, giving people practical skills. 3 years after the initial merger collapse, when Marcus was at a city council meeting, presenting infrastructure plans for a new affordable housing project, he was introduced as Marcus Torres, Vice President of Development, Whitmore Development Group. The title caught him off guard every time. Though he'd had it for over a year now, there was a version of his life where that introduction would never have happened. There was a version where he was still checking the city's electrical grid at 2 in the morning, loving his daughter with everything he had, telling himself he was fine. He was grateful for the actual version, the one where Patricia saw him at the moment of his refusal, understood his capability, and created space for him to grow. The title Patricia and Marcus's story carried, "Come in, I'll show you what you missed," took on meanings neither of them had anticipated. On Amara's 9th birthday, Marcus had arranged for Patricia to meet his mother, who had left him at age 14 because she couldn't bear to watch her neighborhood transform around her, had never met Patricia. The reunion was carefully managed, emotionally fraught, and necessary. Marcus's mother arrived at the birthday party, looking smaller than Marcus remembered her, weathered by the years of living without her son. But Patricia had prepared for this moment. She had reached out months earlier, had explained who she was and why she mattered, had invited her not just to a birthday party, but to be part of her son's actual life. The first time his mother saw Marcus, as he had become, as an engineer, as a man in love, as a father who had stayed, she cried, not redemptive tears, not the tears of someone seeking forgiveness, but tears of recognition. Her son had not just survived without her, he had built something real. Later, after the party had ended, and Amara was asleep, Marcus's mother told him, "You got the better parts of me, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept, the small life that was offered. You just had the sense to stay when I ran." Patricia, giving them space, had stepped outside, but Marcus found her on the porch afterwards. "She's good," Patricia said. "Your mother, she sees what you accomplished." "We accomplished it," Marcus said. "I was still running toward poverty by staying in that job. You recognized that I was capable of something different. And you recognized that I was capable of choosing conscience over comfort," Patricia said. "Everyone else was telling me I was emotional, unstable, making a mistake. You said, okay, let's burn it down." They stood together on the porch of the house they owned, in the neighborhood that Patricia had grown up in, the neighborhood that had transformed around her, that had become almost unrecognizable with its gentrification, and that Patricia was now working to bring back. Not to what it had been, that was impossible. That past was dead, but to something that honored the people who had lived there. That created stability for families, that existed in conversation with its actual residents, rather than in opposition to them. "What do you think about?" Patricia asked. "When you think about that night, when your car broke down?" "I think about the moment I realized you were terrified," Marcus said. "Not of danger, of becoming your uncle, of knowing better and choosing to ignore it anyway. That's the moment I stopped being afraid of you." "I was afraid of you too," Patricia admitted. "Of someone seeing through the composure, of someone asking what I actually wanted, versus what I was supposed to want." "And what do you want?" Marcus asked. "This," Patricia said. "You, Amara, the work. A life where my name means something, because of what I built for other people, not because of how much I extracted from them." 1 year after the Crestwood Community Center opened, the neighborhood held a celebration. It wasn't an official dedication. There had already been plenty of those. This was organic. Community members had organized it themselves, gathering in Crestwood Park to acknowledge the year of transformation, the families that had moved in, the jobs that had been created, the schools that had been revitalized. Marcus and Patricia attended, as they always did for community events. But this time, something was different. As they walked through the park, people recognized them, not as CEO and engineer, as people who had chosen to show up and stay. An elderly woman thanked Patricia for giving her the chance to age in place, in the neighborhood where she had spent 60 years. A young father showed Marcus his daughter's engineering project, inspired by a system Marcus had taught in the community center. A teenager told them he was now planning to study infrastructure design in college, because someone had shown him that it was possible, that it mattered. Amara, now 10, walked beside them with the easy confidence of a child who had been shown repeatedly that her family, whatever shape it took, was stable. She knew her father, she knew Patricia, she knew her mother in the complicated, honest way that children know absent parents who become real again. She knew that adults could make mistakes and make choices, that people could choose each other, that integrity was a practical skill. As they sat on a bench overlooking the park, Marcus reflected on the last 4 years. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked Patricia. "In the diner?" "Every detail," Patricia said. "I was going to help you disappear," Marcus continued. "I thought that was what you needed. But it turned out you needed witness. You needed someone to see you choosing correctly. And you needed someone to see you as capable," Patricia said. "Not as a single father doing his best, under impossible circumstances, as an engineer, as someone whose dreams mattered." They sat together, watching Amara play with community children, watching the neighborhoods that had been slated for destruction begin to heal, understanding that this was what justice looked like when it was built by people, choosing integrity over comfort. Marcus thought about the version of himself from 4 years ago. The man driving home from the night shift, telling himself he was fine, accepting that a good life meant a small life. He thought about the moment he had seen those hazard lights and chosen to stop, not knowing that stopping would change everything. Patricia thought about the moment she had left the hotel without her security detail, running into a blizzard with no plan except the desperate need to not become her uncle. She thought about the moment she had recognized Marcus as the kind of person who would stand for what was right, even when it cost him. They thought about Amara, who would grow up knowing that love was not about rescue or salvation. Love was about recognition. Love was about showing up when it was hard. Love was about choosing every day to stay. 2 years after the merger collapse, on a quiet evening in their shared home, Marcus and Patricia found themselves doing what had become their ritual. Both of them stood in Amara's doorway, watching her sleep, her arm hanging off the bed, still the same position, still the same movement. That had first shown Marcus the reality of love. Years ago, both parents watching her, both understanding that they had been given the profound gift of showing a child what integrity looked like. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked Patricia quietly. "Everything you lost?" Patricia considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I didn't lose anything. I gained everything. The company was never mine to keep. It was mine to steward, and I chose to steward it toward good instead of profit." "What about the money, the status?" "I have money," Patricia said. "Not as much, but enough. And status, real status, comes from showing up for what matters, not from being feared or envied. I'm not sure I even want the other kind anymore." Marcus smiled. They had both been transformed by this choice in ways neither of them could have predicted. Charles was still in prison. He would die in prison, most likely. His sentence was so long. That parole was essentially meaningless. This was not satisfaction. Justice was never satisfying. It was just necessary, but it was closure. Vincent was building a new life, without credentials or power. And something in that had actually redeemed him in a way that money and status never could have. He had written Patricia a letter once. One letter, asking forgiveness he didn't deserve and not expecting it. Patricia had read it and burned it and moved on. Jennifer, Amara's mother, had become a substance abuse counselor. She would never be the mother she should have been, but she was becoming a person who could help others avoid her mistakes. That was honest redemption, not narrative redemption. "I was so afraid that night," Patricia said, standing in Amara's doorway. "Not of being caught, of becoming someone I didn't recognize." "You didn't," Marcus said. "You became someone you actually are, someone your father would recognize." They closed the door softly and moved to their bedroom, understanding without words that this night, like every night, was a choice. They chose each other. They chose the work. They chose the slow, difficult, meaningful work of actually building something good in a world that mostly accepted destruction as inevitable. 5 years after the merger collapse, Whitmore Development had expanded to 12 neighborhood projects. 3 cities were now replicating their model. Marcus had been promoted to Vice President of Development and was working on plans for a national network of community-centered real estate firms. He had completed not just his engineering degree, but was considering a graduate program in sustainable development. Patricia had stepped back from day-to-day operations and handed the company to a diverse leadership team. Younger people, more connected to communities, more aligned with the mission than with profit. She served as board chair and spent most of her time on public speaking, policy work, and consulting with cities, trying to transform their approach to development. The neighborhoods that were supposed to be destroyed had not been destroyed. They had been revitalized. Unemployment was down 23%. Community wealth indicators had improved across all metrics. Families had found stability. Schools had been rebuilt. Hope had returned. Amara was 13 now, brilliant and argumentative and whole. She had designed her own house in an architecture class, Her drawings showed Patricia's eye for elegance, and Marcus's understanding of function blended into something new. She understood infrastructure. She understood community. She understood that some people chose principle and paid the price for it, and were grateful for that price. Marcus's mother had become a regular presence in their lives. The abandonment was never erased. That history lived in all of them. But it had been acknowledged and integrated, made part of the larger story of a woman who had run because she couldn't stay, and a man who had stayed because he understood what his daughter needed, and now a family that existed. In honest recognition of both those choices, Patricia's memory of her father was no longer haunted by doubt. His ethics, his principles, his refusal to compromise, these had been vindicated completely. His name meant something in business circles, not power, integrity. On Amara's 13th birthday, Marcus and Patricia took her to the place where her father's car had broken down 5 years earlier. The spot where everything changed. The blizzard was long gone. It was now spring, and the place looked ordinary and beautiful and completely unremarkable. "Do you know why we're here?" Patricia asked. Amara considered. "Because this is where you met." "Because this is where I was broken," Patricia said. "And your father saw me at the moment of breaking and chose to witness it instead of looking away." "And you chose to stay with my dad," Amara said, "even though it meant losing your company." "I chose to stay," Patricia confirmed, "because some things matter more than companies." Marcus reached out and took both their hands. "Some people matter more," he said, "than money, than status, than comfort. Some people are worth breaking for. Some people are worth staying for." They stood together. Three people who had entered each other's lives through crisis and had chosen to build something real together. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And as the spring wind moved through Crestwood Park, around the neighborhoods that had been saved, through the infrastructure systems that Marcus had designed and communities now understood, past the affordable housing units and community centers and job training programs, they understood something that the world mostly didn't teach. Sometimes a life changes because someone has the courage to stop. Sometimes a conscience changes because someone is willing to witness it. And sometimes two people from completely different worlds collide in a blizzard and discover that the only real wealth is the kind you build together. Not for yourself, but for everyone else. This is what justice looks like when it's built on integrity. This is what grace looks like when it's earned by people choosing their conscience over their comfort. And this is what love looks like when it's built not on rescue, but on recognition. Two people seeing each other completely, understanding each other's capability and courage, and choosing to build something that matters. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about what it means to choose principle over comfort, about how two people from different worlds can recognize each other's value, about what justice actually looks like when built by people willing to pay the price, then subscribe to our channel. We create stories about grace, second chances, and the quiet courage it takes to love well. Because these stories matter. Because people choosing integrity over ambition matters. Because communities deserve to be built by people who see them as homes, not just investments. Subscribe, stay with us, because there are more stories like this, more people choosing what's right, more lives being transformed by recognition instead of rescue. Subscribe our channel.